End of World War II and the American Dilemma. Lecture terms. The American Dilemma. Focus question. How did American minorities face threats to their freedom at home and abroad? Patriotic Assimilation. World War II changed Americans' visions of themselves as a people. The fight against the Nazi Empire and its theory of a master race discredited ethnic and racial inequalities. The cultural pluralism of ethnic and racial minorities in the 1920s and the Popular Front in the 1930s was now promoted by the government. It argued that the United States differed from its enemies in its commitment to the principle that Americans of all races, religions, and national origins could enjoy the four freedoms. Racism was the doctrine of the enemy, while Americanism meant tolerating diversity and equality. By the end of the war, the new immigrants had been accepted as loyal, quote, ethnic Americans, rather than members of, quote, inferior races. World War II brought the new immigrants and their children together with other Americans, drawing millions from urban ethnic neighborhoods and rural areas and mixing them in factories and in the military. This, quote, patriotic assimilation was in stark contrast to the coercive Americanism of World War I, in which the Wilson administration made Anglo-Saxonism a cultural norm. Roosevelt instead embraced cultural pluralism as a basis of harmony in a diverse society, and the government promoted Americanism as equality in opposition to Nazi intolerance. Public officials rewrote the past to define American identity as free of racial or ancestral considerations. Repelled by Nazi ideas of inborn racial differences, biological and social scientists discarded the belief that race, culture, and intelligence were all linked. Even Hollywood depicted soldiers as a motley force of men from diverse regional, ethnic, and religious backgrounds who placed national loyalty above their own individual identities. Bigotry certainly remained part of American life. Anti-Semitism still contributed to the government's offer of refuge to no more than a handful of European Jews escaping the Nazis. But the war made millions of ethnic Americans feel fully American for the first time. But what about non-white groups? The war had less definite meaning for non-white groups. Before Pearl Harbor, racial barriers were still intact. Southern blacks were confined by segregation, and Asians could not immigrate to the United States or become naturalized citizens. Mexican Americans had been deported during the Depression, and most American Indians still lived in deep poverty on reservations. But the war started changes that would have an impact on the post-war period. Under the Bracero program, launched in 1942, tens of thousands of contract laborers migrated from Mexico to the United States to work as domestic and agricultural workers, while so many American men were overseas. The program, designed as a temporary war measure, lasted, however, until 1964. And it brought a total of 4.5 million Mexican workers into our country. The Braceros were assured decent housing and wages, but were not citizens and could be deported at any time. The war also offered opportunities to second-generation Americans to move and find work, and this contributed to the making of the new Chicano culture that fused a Mexican heritage and an American experience. Yet, The Zoot Suit riots of 1943 in Los Angeles, in which sailors and police attacked Mexican American youths wearing flashy clothing, showed the extent of wartime tolerance. But the contrast between discrimination and wartime rhetoric of freedom and pluralism inspired civil rights activism among Mexican Americans. This will lead to protests against employment discrimination. Roughly 500,000 Mexican American men and women served in the military as well. Unequal assimilation. The war also drew into the nation's mainstream many American Indians, thousands of whom served in the Army, left the reservations for war work, not all of whom returned, and many took advantage of GI Bill benefits. In contrast, Asian Americans' experience was a paradox. More than 50,000 children of immigrants from China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines fought in the U.S. Army, mostly in all Asian units. With China as an ally, Congress in 1943 ended exclusion and established a very small quota for Chinese immigration. But many Chinese moved out of ethnic ghettos to work alongside whites in war industry. Japanese Americans had a very different experience, however. While many Americans viewed the war in Europe as an ideological conflict with Nazism, Americans and Japanese viewed the Pacific War as a racial war. Japan's propaganda portrayed America as contaminated with ethnic and racial diversity, as opposed to a, quote, racially pure Japanese. While the attacks at Pearl Harbor stirred long-standing anti-Asian prejudice in the United States. Government propaganda depicted the Japanese as animalistic and subhuman, and blamed Japan's aggression on racial or national characteristics. Most Japanese Americans in the mainland United States worked on farms in California, and while 1/3 were first-generation immigrants, the majority were American-born citizens, many of whom spoke only English and had never been to Japan. Though the government mobilized German and Italian Americans in the war effort and arrested few of the non-naturalized among them, it viewed every person of Japanese ethnicity as a potential enemy. This is the irony. The military, facing an explosion of anti-Asian sentiment and fearing an invasion from Japan, persuaded Roosevelt to issue an order in early 1942 that expelled all persons of Japanese descent from the west coast of the United States. More than 100,000 men, women, and children, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, were removed from the west coast and moved to internment camps far from their homes. In these camps, they were confined in an environment of military discipline and surveillance. Internment demonstrated how easily war erodes basic civil liberties. No court hearings, due process, or writs of habeas corpus challenged the internment. This was also supported almost universally by the press, by the Congress, and by public opinion. The Supreme Court upheld the policy as well, arguing that an order applying only to Japanese was not based on race. Yet internees were asked to buy war bonds, sign loyalty oaths, and consent to being drafted in the Army while they were still interned. Blacks in the war. In contrast to the treatment of Japanese Americans, wartime rhetoric of freedom helped spark significant changes in the status of blacks. While Roosevelt denounced theories of racial mastery, Nazi Germany cited American segregation to support its own policies. Yet segregation and racial violence persisted in the United States. The war stimulated a massive migration of blacks from the rural South to cities in the North and West, but they faced intense hostility, especially in places like Detroit, where in 1943 a fight led to a race riot that killed 34 people and led to what was known as a, quote, hate strike of white workers against black employment at a war production plant. Lynching also continued unabated. Nevertheless, more than 1 million blacks served in the armed forces in segregated units, most of which were limited to construction, transportation, and other non-combatant duties. Many northern black draftees were sent to the South for military training, where they resented the discrimination they faced and the better treatment given to German prisoners of war than to them who were serving. When Southern black veterans sought the benefits of the GI Bill, they often faced discrimination that sharply limited their access. While the GI Bill did not discriminate in its health, college tuition, job training, or other benefits, local administrators in the South curtailed, eliminated, or segregated these benefits to blacks' disadvantage. They found loopholes around which to work. Birth of the Civil Rights Movement. The modern civil rights movement was born during World War II. Resentful of the nearly complete exclusion of African Americans from jobs in the booming war industries, the black labor leader A. Philip Randolph, in July of 1941, called for a march on Washington to demand defense jobs and to end segregation. And an anti-lynching law was what he desired. Randolph, who founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and fought the racism of unions and employers, criticized Roosevelt's inaction by using FDR's own rhetoric, declaring racial discrimination, quote, undemocratic, un-American, and pro-Hitler. The March on Washington idea alarmed Washington officials, and to prevent it, Roosevelt issued an executive order that banned discrimination in defense jobs and created a Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC, in order to track compliance. Armed only with investigative powers, the FEPC, however, could not enforce the anti-discrimination order. But the creation of this entity signaled an important shift in public policy. The FEPC was the first agency since Reconstruction to fight for equal opportunity for blacks, and it helped obtain jobs for black workers in industrial factories and shipyards. By 1944, more than 1 million blacks worked in manufacturing. During the war, the NAACP's membership rose from 50,000 to 500,000. The Congress of Racial Equality, founded in 1942 by an interracial group of pacifists, held sit-ins in northern cities to integrate restaurants and theaters. In early 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier used the phrase that embodied black attitudes during the war, the double V. This meant victory over Germany and Japan, and it argued that must be accompanied by victory over segregation in America. Black newspapers and black critics identified the gap between the Roosevelt administration's celebration of American ideals and the reality of race in the United States. The war in race. During the war, a left-based but broad coalition called for an end to racial inequality in America. African American and Jewish groups campaigned against discrimination in employment and housing. Despite resistance from many white workers, CIO unions, especially those influenced by leftists and communists, tried to organize black workers and win skilled positions for them. Although AFL unions continued to discriminate, CIO unions were far more racially integrated. This new militancy among blacks scared moderate white Southerners, who now stood between blacks protesting segregation and Southern politicians who defended white supremacy and the South's freedom to shape its own race relations. The war that sparked modern civil rights agitation also generated politics that anticipated the, quote, massive resistance to desegregation in the 1950s. But in the North and West, many liberals openly called for a transformation of race relations. Some changes did occur. The National War Labor Board banned racial wage differentials, and the Supreme Court outlawed all-white primaries in elections. These had enabled Southern states to disenfranchise blacks for many years. By the end of the war, the Navy also ended segregation, and the Army had established a few integrated units. The American Dilemma. The new interest in the states of black Americans was evident in the book An American Dilemma, published in 1944 and written by the Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal. While his book depicted an America deeply affected by racism in law, politics, economics, and social behavior, Myrdal also showed appreciation for what he termed, quote, the American Creed, which was a belief in equality, justice, equal opportunity, and freedom. He argued that the war exposed to Americans more than ever the distance between this creed and racial inequality. By urging the federal government to follow American principles by banning racial discrimination, Myrdal established the liberal position on race relations in the post-war America. By 1945, racial justice was integrated in a liberal left agenda that sought full employment, civil liberties, and a larger welfare state for the black Americans. Many liberals now demanded anti-lynching laws, an end to segregated schools and housing, and the expansion of Social Security programs to cover agricultural and domestic workers. The internationalism of black radicals in the early 19th century was revived in the early 20th century, partly in reaction to a new global rule of white supremacy across national lines. Garveyism and the meeting of 5 Pan-African Congresses between 1919 and 1945 that brought together black intellectuals from across the world to denounce colonialism in Africa helped foster this new global consciousness. Black American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who you see here in this picture, met future leaders of African independence movements in trips abroad. Together, they identified the struggles of black Americans with black freedom struggles throughout the world against colonial regimes. They argued that racism had started in the slave trade and slavery and also had persisted through this colonialism. Freeing Africa from colonial rule, they thought, would foster freedom in America as well. The end of the war. Focus question. How did the end of World War II begin to shape the post-war world? The most terrible weapon. In early 1945, Allied triumph seemed inevitable in Europe. Hitler briefly pushed the Allies back in France with a surprise counterattack that created a huge bulge in Allied lines. Though the Battle of the Bulge was the largest single battle ever fought by the U.S. Army and inflicted 70,000 American casualties, the German assault ultimately failed. By March 1945, American troops had crossed into Germany. Hitler killed himself in August 1945, and the Soviet troops took Berlin. On May 8, 1945, VE Day was proclaimed. Victory in Europe. The war against Germany had ended. U.S. forces in the Pacific moved closer and closer to Japan on that island-hopping campaign after retaking Guam and the Philippines in 1944 with a decisive naval victory at Leyte Gulf. In the 1944 presidential election here in the United States, Roosevelt defeated Thomas E. Dewey, a Republican governor of New York, and he won an unprecedented fourth term as president. But FDR would not live very much longer. He died on April 12, 1945, before the Allies were able to secure a victory. His successor, Harry Truman, immediately faced an extraordinary decision: whether to use the atomic bomb against Japan. Truman, not knowing about the bomb before becoming president, was told by the Secretary of War once he became president that the United States had built, quote, the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. The bomb was the product of Einstein's theory of relativity, which led scientists to use uranium, or man-made plutonium, to create an atomic reaction that could generate enormous power. This power could be used for peaceful purposes, or it could be used to generate a colossal explosion. Fleeing Germany for the United States before the war began, Einstein warned Roosevelt that the Nazis were trying to build an atomic weapon themselves, and he urged Roosevelt to do the same. FDR launched the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program in which scientists during the war developed an atomic bomb, which was first tested in New Mexico in July of 1945. The end of the war. On August 6, 1945, a U.S. plane dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. It virtually destroyed the entire city and killed 70,000 immediately. 140,000 more died from radiation by the end of 1945, and thousands more died in the next 5 years due to complications from exposure to that radiation. 3 days after dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, the United States dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, Japan, that killed 70,000 more. The same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Japan quickly surrendered. The catastrophic number of civilian casualties caused by the bombs have ever since made the decision to drop them very controversial. Japanese forces fiercely resisted America's advance in the Pacific, and Truman's advisors warned him that an American invasion of Japan might cost the lives of 250,000 or more American troops. But the United States did not plan to invade until 1946, and there were signs that Japan was close to surrender. Japan indicated that it would surrender if Emperor Hirohito retained his throne. Emperor Hirohito remaining on the throne did not meet the Allied demands for unconditional surrender. However, after the bomb was dropped, the Allies did let him stay. Some scientists who developed the atomic bomb asked Truman to use it just to show its power to other nations. And ultimately, this would embark the United States upon the atomic age and will eventually color Cold War policies with the Soviet Union. The use of the atomic bomb represented a logical endpoint to the way in which World War II was fought, namely at great cost to civilian lives. Compared to World War I, in which 90% of deaths were military personnel, in World War II, 20 million of the 50 million who died were civilians. The Nazi regime had systematically killed its enemies, including millions of Jews, and bombed London and other cities, attacking civilians. The Allies in turn bombed German cities, such as Dresden, where 100,000 civilians also perished. In March 1945, nearly the same number died in the U.S. bombing of Tokyo. Although the war and government propaganda led many Americans to dehumanize the Japanese, and few criticized Truman's use of the bomb, public criticism aroused by images of civilian suffering would begin to mount in the coming years. The post-war world. During the conflict, meetings between Allied leaders outlined the architecture of international relations in the post-war period. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Iran in 1942 and at Yalta in the Soviet Union in 1945 to develop agreements for what they thought should happen in the post-war world when Germany and Japan were defeated. The last, quote, Big Three conference occurred at Potsdam, outside Berlin, in July of 1945, soon after Germany had surrendered, but the war in Japan continued. The Potsdam Conference involved Stalin, Truman, and Churchill, because by this point, FDR had passed away. There, the three Allied leaders created a military administration for Germany to occupy it and divide it into zones of occupation, and they agreed to try Nazi officials for war crimes against humanity. None of the three great Allied powers entirely trusted the others, and each vied for geostrategic advantage. The Allies' decision to delay the invasion of Europe cost many Russian lives on the Eastern Front and incited Soviet resentment against those Western allies. But their sacrifice did persuade Britain and the United States to allow the Soviet Union to dominate Eastern Europe after the war. At the Yalta Conference, just weeks before Roosevelt's death, Roosevelt and Churchill barely protested Stalin's plans to control areas of Eastern Europe that had been part of the Russian Empire before World War I. Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan later in 1945 to include non-communists in the pro-Soviet Polish government if he was given Poland, and he also agreed to allow, quote, free elections there. But Stalin intended to make Eastern Europe communist, and soon the Allies disagreed over the region's fate. Churchill also resisted United States pressure to move toward national independence for India and other British colonies, and he made separate private deals with Stalin to split Southern and Eastern Europe into separate spheres of influence. Britain also fought American efforts to control the post-war global economy. Delegations from 45 nations that met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July 1945 replaced the British pound with the U.S. dollar as the main currency for international exchange. During the Depression, FDR had taken the United States off the gold standard, but Bretton Woods again forged a link between the dollar and gold and set other national currencies at a fixed rate in relation to the U.S. dollar. The meeting also created two U.S.-dominated financial institutions. The World Bank would provide money to developing nations and help rebuild Europe, and the International Monetary Fund would prevent governments from devaluing their currencies for trade advantages. These would both be dominated by the United States. Bretton Woods created the structure of the post-war global capitalist economy that made goods and investment more free and recognized American dominance of world finance. American leaders asserted that free trade would encourage world economic growth, an assumption that continued to govern U.S. foreign policy for over a generation. The thought was that free enterprise would eventually stimulate more democratic governing. The United Nations. In 1944, near Washington, D.C., the Allies also founded a successor organization to the failed League of Nations that had been established after World War I. This new international organization would be the United Nations, or the UN, and it would consist of a General Assembly of Nations where each member nation had an equal voice, except for the fact that Russia had 3 votes because of its size. It would also consist of a Security Council tasked with maintaining world peace and security. The Security Council of the UN had 6 rotating members and 5 permanent ones. The 5 permanent members would be Great Britain, China, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Each would have the power to veto resolutions that the General Assembly passed. The United States felt that they could use this against a growing Soviet Union in the future if need be. In June of 1945, 51 countries meeting in San Francisco adopted the UN Charter, which outlawed force or its threat as a means for settling international disputes, and Congress endorsed it the following month. The war radically redistributed world power. The major military powers of Japan and Germany were defeated. Britain and France were weakened by the fighting, while only America and the Soviet Union could still project their own power on the international stage. The United States essentially became the dominant nation in the world. But international harmony did not follow the peace. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe soon helped spark the Cold War, and the atomic bombs inspired much fear across the globe. Armageddon seemed a reality. Allied rhetoric of freedom was not always followed in the post-war policies either. In 1941, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and FDR issued the Atlantic Charter, which assured that Nazi Germany's defeat would be followed by free trade, self-government for all nations, and a global New Deal. It specifically embraced freedom from want and freedom from fear, but left out the other 2 of the 4 freedoms, in deference to British colonial rule in India, where the Britons preferred not to grant freedom of speech and freedom of worship. The 4 freedoms in the Atlantic Charter were intended to solidify world opposition to the Axis powers, but it also laid the foundation of human rights and inspired colonized peoples to adopt the same language and ideals of freedom and national self-determination for themselves. They would use this language and these ideals in their own struggles against the victorious Allied countries in the post-war world. This would cause more conflict in the future. A perfect example of this would be Gandhi's use of the same kind of language in India's struggle for self-rule after the war's end.